All right, so we're live. We're good? Okay. All right, everyone. We're going to start the book of Titus tonight. The hope would be that we get through a chapter and a half, and then next week we finish a chapter and a half. I don't know if we'll get that far. Some of the deeper topics in Titus will come in this first chapter. I will present them, and we'll go as far with them as you folks want to go with them, and discussion and that type of thing, and we'll just keep moving forward. Titus is a tremendous book to learn what God's asking us to be like as Christian leaders, but also as Christians in a very secular culture. Not that we can't relate to that, right? So it's a tremendous book for that. I'm just going to take a few moments and give you the background to both Titus and the place that he's going to be ministering. You may have remembered, those of you who sat in on my Acts 27 class, remember when Paul was put on a ship? He was a prisoner and put on a ship, and they sailed around an area, an island, and they got stuck there because of the hurricane-like storm, and then eventually he was taken to Rome. One of the main areas he was stuck for a while was a little island called Crete. Crete is just south, and there's a water barrier, but it's just south of Ephesus. We know the book of Ephesians, right? It's just south of Patmos. Does anybody remember why that place matters? John wrote Revelation there in Patmos, and he was exiled there. It's just south of Corinth. We know where the Corinthian book was written. And just as a little history thing, it's just south of Sparta, which if you ever saw the movie 300 with all the warriors and the Spartans and all that kind of thing, that's the Spartans in Sparta, and it's just below that also. So just a little history on that. So we look at this area. First, let's look at Titus. Titus was a Greek Christian, which means his background was what? Greek and Gentile, right? He was not brought up in a Christian home. But we read about how at some point he became a follower of Christ and actually ministered with the Apostle Paul. And in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, is that right? I think that's right. Paul writes to the Galatians, he says, 14 years later, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation God had given me to preach to them. But I did this privately for the leaders for fear of them. They'd stop me from running the race. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was Greek. And so here's the confirmation in Galatians that we know Titus was someone Paul mentored. Just like he mentored many other young men to be preachers of the gospel. And he must have been so impressed with this young man, Titus, that eventually Paul is going to release and call Titus to go to this area called Crete, this island called Crete. Now, listen to a little bit of background about this island, Crete. Not that it matters much, but in the Greek, it's pronounced kretizo. And that word means liar, scoundrel, or treacherous. This is where people went who were trying to escape the law. Where people went, I shared with you on Sunday morning that I've been doing a lot of studying of the history of pirates. And there were certain areas and certain islands, the pirates like Nassau, they'd all come to, and it would be like almost a pirate island, so to speak. This island, Crete, was an island where a lot of kind of ruffians and people who were, as I said, escaping the law, they all came and formed a society. So as you can imagine, it was a ripe place for the gospel, right? All right. So, challenging but good. The challenges were definitely there. We know that Paul at least had delivered the gospel there while he stayed there, while they were waiting for the storm to pass. We don't know how long he was there. We know that Paul developed the beginnings of some churches. And now he's sending Titus back to these churches to see where they're at and how they are developing. And so this island, Crete, it was known for being an unsafe area full of immorality and corruption. But it was a strategic place because they had harbors all around this large island where people could come, just like it happened to Paul, stop there for a while, move on to another place. So why do you think, and we don't have an exact answer for this, but just as you're kind of thinking out loud, why do you think Paul would send Titus, as far as we know, all by himself, to an area of ministry like Crete? Because he was an organizer, okay? That's good. I was hoping someone would catch that. That he had a Greek background. So as far as language and culture, he was very familiar with it. And that's a huge help, isn't it? Yeah. Any other ideas? What's that? He knew that he had the inner toughness to do what had to be done. Paul would not have sent, like, if you remember Demas in the Bible, I don't know if you remember his name, he got so scared of sharing the gospel that he ran off and took off from Paul. And John Mark, for a while, took off from Paul. That's not the kind of guy you send to Crete, right? You send Titus, who we see as someone who stood strong with Paul throughout the latter half of his ministry. And so he sends this guy Titus. What do you think Titus was thinking when Paul said, "The Lord gave me a word, Titus. You are going to go and be a type of bishop, an apostle to a group of people." And Titus is like, "All right, I'm ready. Where's the Lord sending me?" Crete. What do you think his first reaction was? That's almost like God saying, "You have a prison ministry, I'm going to get you arrested." You know what I mean? It's that kind of idea. And so here we have the beginning of the book of Titus. That's a little of the background. I'm going to go into a little more of the background in just a moment. But it starts off in Titus chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, a servant of God. Now, I don't want us to get past that word real quick. Because the word servant, does anybody's translation have a different word? Bondservant. Some of the older translations might have the translation slave. Okay? The idea is the Greek word doulos. It means a full committal of oneself to a person, a family, or in this case, to a God. That you are now a full servant of that God. I apologize, I forget the name of the athlete, but I just read today on Twitter there was a high-level, high-athlete NFL player for the Colts, and he was about to make a lot of money, and he just put out this little tweet thing. He said, "The Lord has told me that I'm called into the ministry, and so I'm going to be leaving the Colts." And he thanked the organization, he thanked everyone, thanked his fans, and he said, "But I know that God has called me to it." And it was fascinating to read the comments underneath it. You could tell those who weren't believers, they were like, "Well, that's stupid. Use your money and support the church," and all this. They didn't get, and your pastor's never been one to not share a thought. And so I said, "You don't understand that the idea," I was thinking of this word doulos, and I said, to offer oneself to Christ in ministry is to become a servant to him, and whatever he asks of you, you do. And that's why it's not about you, it's about him. Didn't get a response. But that being said, what's that? Amen. I could get an amen, but that's what this word means. Paul is saying, "I have sacrificed my life to the God that I love." So he first says he's a servant to Christ, and then he says he's an apostle of Jesus Christ. Does anybody remember what that word apostle means? One sent out. It isn't just someone who was part of the original 12, right? It started there, but it means one sent. And so Paul saw himself as one sent by Christ as his servant to go into the world. And then he says, to the elect, or for the faith of God's elect and the knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. He says, a faith and knowledge resting on the hope of eternal life, which God, who does not lie, promised before the beginning of time. He's saying the reason I'm doing this is because God has shown himself faithful to me. He has given me eternal life. And so my whole ministry is to help those who are elect, those who are called to Christ, to come to Christ. That's the focus of my ministry and the focus of who God is. Now, what's fascinating, the island of Crete, the people that lived there at that time, there was a mythology going around. Do you remember, anybody remember who the Greeks worshipped, who the gods were? Apollos. Who? Zeus. I thought you said Jesus. I'm like, nah. Zeus. You remember some of those Greek things? Some of you have Aphrodite. Yes, we're pulling back to our earlier days, aren't we? Well, they believed that Zeus actually was born or created, whichever word you want to use, on that island. So they had a strong connection to Zeus. So Zeus worship was huge on Crete. And there was much mythology that taught about how Zeus was the type of god that often was treacherous. He would often lie and manipulate to get what he wanted. And they had all these mythological stories. So if that is your background, as far as your religious understanding, and someone introduces a new god into the picture, how are you going to view that new god with what you already know? Disdain, possibly? What? Contempt, possibly? Now, if you've come to the point where you're willing to embrace that God, you can see how they would easily mix their teachings of Zeus and the Greek gods in with Jesus. And I share this because this is the community we live in today, meaning a culture, the community we live in, where Jesus is great as long as he mixes in to what I want to believe about other gods or other things. And it becomes this ugly mixture. It's far worse than atheism. Because atheism's real clear. Don't believe in God, you believe in God. Black and white, right? Difference. This is, well, you believe in Jesus, so do I. But this is how I see Jesus. And I don't like this part of Jesus, but I love this part of Jesus. And they tried to, people mix him together now with who they want him to be. And that's what was going on in Crete, is you had, for the lack of a better term, Christian leaders that Titus was sent to this church, but their lives were a mix of Christianity and Greek mythological worship all put together. So you can imagine what preaching would have been like at a place like that, right? Or how they would have decided to live their lives. There was no Jesus and no other. So Paul starts out by saying, I'm a slave to this God. This is who I am. And he goes on and he says, at the appointed season, God brought his word to light through the preaching entrusted to me by the command of our Savior. And he says, to Titus, my true son. Was Titus his son? That's a trick question, isn't it? What kind of son was Titus to Paul? What's that sound? My true child. Okay. A spiritual son, right? Many of us may have ministered to young men or young women, or have been ministered to by someone older, and that's that relationship. And so, though Titus wasn't his physical son, certainly Paul was a Jewish Pharisee, and he was born on Titus was born on the other side of the world, so to speak, over in Greece. And so there wasn't a physical bond, but to Paul, he had loved this man so much that they developed this intimate bond. Now, as we move into, I'm going to talk about this now. Here's what I want us to think about. If you're Paul and you have this young man that you clearly have invested years in, who was faithful to you amidst all you went through with prisons and beatings, and who embraced the Lord that you embraced, knowing what I just told you about Crete and the church that was there at this time and the leaders' mix of religions and everything else, how would you tell him to go about? He's sending him, like what we would use as a modern term, a bishop to this church to bring correction. So if you're Paul, what are some of the things you would tell Titus to do when he first gets there? Don't let them influence you, first of all, right? Because that would just be 10 times worse then all of a sudden, right? So don't let their influence affect you. What else? To find some other strong believers that you can start to encourage and build yourselves up. That's key. From who? Set yourself apart from who? From those that are teaching the wrong things. How do you do that if you're sent to bring correction to a church? Right. So amongst the community, there should be something different about you, right? Have you looked ahead to chapter 3? Very good. Save that same, you're right, and save that response for when we get to 3 next week, because that's really good, because that's a good observation. Anyone else? That you need to set yourself, be in the community, but set yourself, not above them, but set yourself out as someone who sees God and practices Christianity in a different way than what is being done in the community around you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We don't know how long Paul was there, so we don't know how much he equipped them with. So again, they didn't have a Bible at the time, right? So they couldn't go back and say, well, in Peter it says. There was no Peter, it says, at that time. So we can't think that terribly about these people at that moment, because they may have only had Paul for a couple months and just done their best to figure it out along the way. Jim, and then Greg. Yep. Good. Okay, so start with the commonalities. Okay, so you like this, I like this, you like this, I like this, you like that? No, but not quite that aggressive. Okay, Greg. Yes, yeah, and hopefully they remembered it somewhat similarly, because if we all went to hear 10 sermons back to back to back, are you going to tell me we all remember the exact same thing? No. Go ahead, Terry. Yep. To do. That's the key. Now, yeah. Right. He's got to establish himself. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Of course, get part of the bowling team, or play softball, church softball, or something like that, and get to know people. I'm not joking. I'm serious. Like, no, I am with softball, but I mean, yeah. There is a very practical side of it, to build rapport with people that didn't. I mean, they may remember Titus, but they know he comes with Paul's authority, but that doesn't mean that there's a connection built yet, or it may have passed. That's good, James. Yeah. See, they were shipwrecked there for a while. We don't know exactly, but we know it had to be within a couple years, because Paul wrote this to Titus probably while he was imprisoned in Rome. So immerse yourself, learn, and go out, right? Okay. Now, you do one thing quick, Greg? Well, we know he was in Corinth. We know because Paul writes to him and talks about him in Corinth. We know he was in Galatia because he talks about him in Galatia. Could he have been in Ephesus? possibly, but he doesn't use his name in that book. That doesn't mean he wasn't. But I would think so, yeah. Because again, it's a short little ship trip up and down. So yeah. Now, let me give you a picture of what Paul is going to tell Titus he should do. Now, he doesn't say you have to do this on day one, but this is his goal. Imagine with me if this Sunday, let's make it in August, the new bishop shows up, Bishop Alex Farmer. And he says, I've been watching Pastor Matt's old videos, old sermons, and I deem him to be a heretic, and I am booting him out of this church. What's more is I met with your vestry, and they all seem to want to buy into what Matt was saying, and so I'm booting them out of leadership in this church. I then met with the staff, and the staff seems to be unrelenting in sticking with Matt, and so I booted them out of leadership in the church, and we're going to start from scratch. How well is that going to... What's that? No, maybe with one or two people, but no. Right, exactly. But that is what Paul is going to tell Titus to do. He's going to say, any leaders that you see that are not willing to, so to speak, repent and become part of what we know a Christian leader should act and look like, you're going to remove them. And then you're going to find other ones who can step into their place and do it right. That's a serious call that Paul's putting on Titus, don't you think? And so we don't know, again, how long Titus was there. We have to assume it wasn't too long, but he may have gotten his feet wet for a little bit. And so the next set of verses is going to be the things that Paul tells Titus that he has to establish when he gets there. Does anybody have any questions before we move into that? You look like you have a question. No. When he says he's a son in the faith, you have to assume that he's on the younger side, but younger doesn't mean teenager. Younger can mean in his 20s or 30s or something like that, because Paul's older. So we don't know exactly how old he was. We know that he was not circumcised because we read that he didn't have to get circumcised when he was in Galatia. But that doesn't give away a whole lot either. I don't think men of any age would encourage wanting to be circumcised. So that doesn't really give us any age group bracket. So we don't know, other than he was probably what we would consider a younger pastor or bishop or whatever in this situation, but not young. Because he traveled with Paul for a while. Yeah. From what I recall, 60 was considered very old at that time. So I'm going to guess around 40 to 45 was the median age. Just like with us, it's like 70, 75, something like that now. So I'm going to say 40, 45. So if Paul was at the top end of that, you figure that Titus, and this is truly just a guess, folks, okay? You might guess he might have been around 25, 30, something like that. He was clearly younger because we saw him as a son in the faith. So that's a good question. Yeah. What? We don't know for sure. One would have to assume he was on the older side, given the lateness he came to the gospel and the amount of time. Acts, we know, happened over many, many, many years. It wasn't, a quick read. And so I'm gonna guess 60, 65, but I don't know that for sure. You could Google it. Right. But back then, that's where age is tough, and I'll be prepared. I'll be honest, I'm not totally prepared to handle the age question, because we can go back to Abraham, and he was what was it, 800? No, Noah was like 800. Abraham was what, 100 something? Yeah, 100 something. His wife was like 100 something giving birth, and so yeah. So there still could miraculously be hope for all of us here, ladies. No, I'm just kidding. All right, we're just kidding on that part. All right. If you don't mind, just because I don't know the full answer to those questions, I'm going to move on. But you can Google it and find it out real quick if you want to. All right. So this is what Paul tells Titus he should be looking for in his leaders. And what's neat is this first section will be about leaders. Hopefully we get past it, and then he talks about what the older women are supposed to be like, the younger women, the younger men, the slaves. He is giving a whole picture of what Christian life should look like for anyone. as we move through this. But the first part is about leaders. So if he's saying something about leaders now, is it applicable to today? So it wasn't just for leaders then, right? It's for Christian leadership all the way through now and forever, evermore till he comes again. Okay, so I want to make sure we're on the same page with that. In verse 5, Paul says, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. He makes it sound so easy. Just appoint some elders. Yeah, and those guys doing it, chuck them. Okay. The word elder is presbyteros, which means presbyter, or can be shortened to guess what it means? Priest. Okay? Now I'm going to get into what that means in just a moment. But I want you to notice, and we're going to not jump too far ahead, but in verse 7, it says, since an overseer, or as some of your translations may have, it might say, since a bishop is entrusted. Okay? That is a different Hebrew or different Greek word. And overseer or bishop, and it is episkopos, one of those two. Episcopate, thank you. It was there. See, I was just speaking in tongues. You didn't catch that. You didn't interpret it for me. But no, okay, just kidding. Just kidding. Speaking in Greek. So, but there are two different groups of people. He's talking about those who are called to be priests and those who are called to be bishops and so forth in this time. And so he goes on, he says, an elder or a priest, you could put that word in there, must be blameless. What does it mean to be blameless? Does that mean they have to be sinless? We're not going to have a lot of priests if they have to be sinless, right? No. Me and maybe one other guy. Just kidding. But no. Only Jesus was perfectly sinless. High moral character according to who? Or what? According to Paul. See, we'd love to say according to the Bible, but there was only an Old Testament. But still, according to the Old Testament, that's a high moral character that was expected of Christians. And Paul's going to break it down for him real clear. So, can we agree that it doesn't mean sinless, right? But it does imply that one has to care if they are in sin. Did you follow me on that? So it doesn't mean sinless, but it also doesn't mean careless with sin either. It means that obviously that you're seeking to be holy. They must be the husband of one wife. Okay, now let's get dirty. All right, the husband of one wife. So does that mean that according to Paul, priests should all be men? I just want to see how gutsy people are to respond. And so, okay, let me give you a little bit of background here. In fact, I'm going to read the next verse because the two go together, and then I'm going to give you a lot of background. An elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Okay. Now, let's take the second half of this first, okay? The husband of one wife. Does that mean that he's talking about polygamy? Yes. Certainly he's talking about polygamy, right? So, in case any of you are wondering, if you want to be a leader in the church, no polygamy, okay? If you don't want to be a leader, have fun. No, I'm just kidding. That's not true either. But no polygamy. But does that also mean that a priest, if their spouse dies, should not remarry? One wife at a time. We agree upon that, right? Who the heck would want more than that? One's more than enough. So, I love dangerous ground. Let's have some fun. So, do you think Paul could also be saying that if your wife dies, you should not remarry if you're a priest? The Roman Catholic Church, we know that they are not to marry, right? They took this verse way strong. That's not what he's saying here.
Yeah, but St. Gregory done that because the priesthood was being passed down through family.
Right.
There was a reason for that.
Right. But just for us now, the Roman Catholic Church does not allow priests to marry, right? Male priests, they can't marry. If you're married as a male priest, some are allowed to become priests in the Roman Catholic Church, but if your wife dies, you don't remarry. in the Orthodox Church, the big O Orthodox Church, which is huge in other parts of the world, Russia, Uganda, all these different areas, all in that side of the world, the Orthodox Church is huge. They believe that if you are a married priest and your spouse passes, that you are not to remarry if you're going to remain a priest. Because they see this verse as saying that, and the reason they believe that, and I'm not arguing yes or no, I'm just sharing with you, is because they believe that if your spouse dies, you can no longer treat the women of the church as if they were your daughters if you're looking to marry one of them. Does that make sense? So now that I share the reasoning, we may not agree, but that's logical, right? I mean, that's understandable, right? For the Anglican Church, we can do whatever we want. No, that's not quite right. But in the Anglican Church, if your spouse dies, you can remarry again. That's not a problem at all. The reason I mention those three churches and not the Baptist or Methodist or any of those is because the three churches I mentioned to you represent about 70% of Christianity and 100% of historic Christianity. 100% is a little strong, but a huge percentage of historic Christianity going back to 1600 and earlier. Okay? So, understand that teaching about marriage is what is held by those three main parts of the church. Now, back to my original thought with you. And you're welcome to share your opinion, or you can keep it to yourself. That's fine. In the Roman Catholic Church, can women be deacons, priests, or bishops? The deacon one, is that official? I know they're working for the deacon. Is that official? So deacon, but definitely not priest or bishop, right? Okay, thank you for that. I wasn't sure if that... Women can't be priests in the Roman Catholic Church. Not in the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, not in the Roman Church. No, not in the Roman Catholic Church. And in the Orthodox Church, can women be deacon, priests, or bishops? No. In the Anglican Church of North America, us, can a woman be a deacon? Can a woman be a priest? Can a woman be a bishop? I'm not saying what you believe. I'm not saying what the Anglican Church believes. Can a woman be are there women... See, you're going semantics, and I'm with you. But are there women who hold the role of priest in the Anglican Church of North America? Are there women that hold the office of bishop in the Anglican Church of North America? No, they cannot be bishops. Because they understand that the idea that a woman must listen to a man, that if you have a male bishop, that falls under there. This is not something I plan on going too deep into tonight. But know that this is a tremendously difficult issue within the Anglican Church of North America. Almost to the point where it's a 50-50 split on whether... Now, almost, not all, but I'd say a huge proportion believe women can be deacons. That they're meant to teach and equip and do what deacons do. Go visit the sick, do those types of things. Not all, but a large percentage. Maybe a 50-50 split believe that they should be female priests. And at some point, I'm just going to tell you, whether it's a year from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the denomination is going to split over this issue. Because it's that... Why do you think it's that important of an issue for people? There was never a woman Anglican priest until 1944. So, for the first 400 years of Anglicanism, there wasn't any. When the feminist movement hit America and such, that's when they started ordaining female priests. And obviously it's been... What's that? 1944 is the first female Anglican... I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I think so. I think in America the first one was in the 70s, but I'm not... Is that right? I think that's right. So I did a lot of reading on this. See, you can't break it down that simply. Because like in Uganda they believe one way, in Nigeria they believe another way. So there is no consistent answer to answer your question with that. Because each group of each diocese, so to speak, of area... Providence, thank you, believe differently. So there's no one answer to that question. My Baptist friend, yes. Right.
So to some extent, you might need in some areas a female priest.
What would the female priest do that a female deacon couldn't do?
Well, I think there are different elements, right?
Well, there are, but you see what that would be the argument on the other side is the female. Can I ask real quick, guys? Chris Klukas, his wife, is she a deacon or a priest? Do you know? I thought so, but I wasn't 100% sure. So yeah. Well, can I just stop you right there? Did you hear what she said? No, I want this one. I want this one. She said, society's changing, so it has to change. I could make the same argument that homosexuality. Do you see where that, do you see, they call that the slippery slope. And I would have taken whatever side you folks say. I'll take both. I know all the arguments, so. Okay. Okay.
According to what the deacons were always known to go into the darkest, most violent, most dangerous areas of the world. That's what a deacon was supposed to do. Now, mind you, yeah, then there's our deacons that can't quickly went to the hospital and places like that. It's still a dangerous place. But deacons were more like behind Titus going into Crete.
Collis, were you going to say something? He said it for you. Good job. All right. Now, just in these 5 minutes, can you see why it is such a hot button topic? Because if you believe women can be, and if you notice, I'm hanging right on the middle right now, all right? I'm purposely doing that because that makes for better conversation, okay? So whichever side you take, I'll push the other just to get good conversation, get us thinking. But we can't ignore the verse that we just read, right? And an elder must be blameless and a husband of one wife. So we either have to believe that Paul was speaking this book of Titus to a certain culture and it's not relevant today, but by doing so, we then say perhaps the whole book is not relative today. Do you see the slippery slope? Can I start over here and go right around? Go ahead, Ben. Or it's not. Right. Right. Thank you. And that would be the strong perspective on that side. Absolutely. I'm just going to sweep right across the room. So Jim and then Greg.
For those older than me, when did World War II end? So in the middle 40s. They've already been through one World War. Now they're getting to be in another, so men were a lot more scarce. That could be why women popped up.
Could be. That could be part of it. Yeah, because we saw that throughout the whole society and culture. So that's a good point, just historically to think about. I think, Greg, you're next.
I was just gonna say, if you're gonna throw that out, Titus out, because of that, then you have to throw out First Timothy chapter 3,
Absolutely.
which is an older one. It says basically the same thing.
Yep.
qualifications for deacon and priest.
And if you're going to throw out 1 Timothy, you might as well throw out 2 Timothy. And next thing you know, you're scrapping the Bible apart and choosing what you like, right? And so, yeah.
Well, I kind of look at it, I got maybe this one again, I thought Paul would be more concerned about the business of multiple wives. If you look back at the early days when the wives were quite common, Solomon, David, Ruth, yeah, I mean, multiple wives, but somewhere it had to end.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth in that, Bill, because he even talked in another book about how he thought it was best not even to have a wife because it would free him totally up. But he also says, but it's also better not to burn, and it's okay to get a wife too. But that's what you're saying is, if you start to have multiple, then all of a sudden it absorbs your whole life, and the ministry can't be where it needs to be. Sure, sure, I would agree. Yeah. Okay, now, by church fathers, what Terry is talking about is, for the most part, the teachings of the church for the first 400 to 500 years. Now, some people stretch that a little, but that's a pretty good time frame. The church fathers' strong position was that it had to be a male-only leadership. It was a male-only leadership all the way until 1944. So it's not like there's no way you can argue around that. So the history from the church fathers to the Reformation to wherever, it was male leadership in the church. No, I want to say one thing. When I say male leadership, I don't mean there weren't dynamic female missionaries, leaders, teachers, equippers. In fact, Paul's going to go on to a whole thing about how women can be doing that in the church. And let's not forget that if you take the position that women should not be priests, if you take that position, it's not a sexist thing because 999 men out of 1,000 are not called to be priests either, right? It's a specific calling. It's not about male, female, so to speak. It's a specific calling that's on your life. And so, I think, does that answer your question? I do have quotes and stuff, but I don't want to go into all that right now. They'll bog us down too far. But if you want them afterwards, I can show you a bunch of quotes. I have them. Yeah, did you do your But that's the argument, the person that takes that perspective, you have to be able to spiritually break down what Paul meant when he said, must be a husband of one wife. That he didn't really mean just husbands. So you'd have to be able to defend that biblically, not just culturally. Because culturally, I agree with you. That's the easy answer. But it runs into this passage and the one in Timothy where it says women should learn in silence and so forth. Like, you have to still be able to wrestle with those scriptural texts, because I'm sure we're all doing Bible study because we believe it's the Word of God. That's, at least I hope, that's why, or at least we're hoping to learn to discover that if we don't. And so culturally, I agree with that argument, but then we still have to deal theologically with these passages, how we're going to handle them. Does that make sense? And,
but it's like one word.
yeah, but an important one. But it's. Right, and I really like how you present it. Yeah. I like how you presented it, Tam, because it isn't in any way taking power. See, that's what the feminist movement would want to do. It's not taking power away from women. It's that there's a helpmate system that God has set up in the world around us, and that's what it. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing about it is unmentioned calling. That's the key word, because God doesn't call nobody else. God calls 9 out of every 10 people, 9 of them are male, 1 female. That's God's will. That's God's calling. And the other part that I think we're missing, I didn't bring this up, but and maybe this is true or not true on the Catholic side,
Right. And even though they're not called deacons, nuns really do the work of a deacon as it's described in Scripture. And I hope I'm not overstating that. So I'm agreeing with you, but I believe they have that equipping calling that in their lives to do that. And so, yeah.
A job that may not be that good at. Yes, he's a kid.
Right. So, all right.
I can remember when women first become priests in the Episcopal Church, and at that time I thought that was a pretty neat thing. I started seeing how they were changing liturgy, how they were changing things because he had a spouse in that. But then what come along was the homosexuality, the lesbian, the gay bishop that brought gays up into
Right.
the division, and it was mainly the women priests that pushed the gay issue for men.
Right, and that was true then, but I never want to make the statement because, I know Chris's wife, and she would never take that position. You know what I mean? So, people often say it's a slippery slope, and I think historically that is true, but I never want to put that on some of the godly women I know on the other side of it, and so. Okay, all right. Well, if it's okay. Okay. Well, if it's okay, we're going to move on from here. All right. If you want to know some of my deeper thoughts about it, I'm happy to talk with you one-on-one. But my goal was to get us thinking and talking, just because if you stay Anglican, it's eventually going to become a bigger and bigger deal. Right now, there's some dioceses that refuse to ordain women, and there's some dioceses that allow it, and there's some dioceses that encourage it within the ACNA, the Anglican Church of North America. So right now, it is an incredibly split issue. And it's not one that I believe we're going to figure out tonight, but it was an opportunity. There's only a couple scriptures that talk about it, so I thought if we hit one, we might as well talk about it a little bit and take a little time together. So thank you, everyone, for a very mature dialogue in this, and I appreciate it. All right, let's get on to some other things. So we know the husband of one wife, and just real quick, I was going to take more time on this, but it's a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Now, I want to be clear. Something that I know I've worked with other priests, other pastors who have been attacked by churches. They'll have an autistic son who acts out in church, and people say, well, then you shouldn't be in leadership. We have to be really, really careful to not take this verse and make it say what we want it to say. Does everybody hear that? Right. And there's also, I heard James Dobson say it this way once, that once your child is out of the house, their walk with God is their own. And so if you have a 40-year-old son and he's in not that you're 40, but if someone has a 40-year-old son and they're walking in disobedience, they can't come back to you and say, oh, they're disobedient. You can't be a leader. So now I do think there's something to be said that perhaps there's times that a leader needs to invest more time at home. And I've told, especially some men who have wanted to, not so much here, but in other places who have wanted to lead, I've said, I think your wife and kids need you a little bit more right now, and we love you, and we believe you're called to leadership, but not at this moment. But I just want to make sure I'm clear that people have used this verse to beat people over the head who are going through a tough season with their kids, and that is not what this verse is talking about at all. You can imagine, we had 8 kids. They didn't all grow up picking daisies and saying, yes, ma'am, okay, or yes, sir, all the time, all right? So now they do. No, I'm just kidding. But no Van Trapp families? Nope. Okay, all right. She does. I know at the Kirk home they don't line up and sing to you when you come over, Robin. I know that doesn't happen. So, all right. So, does anybody have any thoughts on that before I keep moving? I didn't feel it was worth a lot of time, but I just want to, if anybody's ever been attacked by this verse and about leadership, I just wanted to make sure I clarified some things for people. So, it is to be taken seriously, but it can't be overdone. Okay. Now, he moves on to the word overseer here. And again, this word is a different Greek word referring to those who are called to the role of bishops. And just real quick, I think you'll all appreciate this. I won't take a lot of time on this. If it makes you feel better, next week will be all about you folks. Does that sound good? Women, men, older men. And so, we take it hard today. Well, why do you think he goes after the leaders first? Leaders lead, right? If you have corrupt leadership, you're either going to scare away those that are obedient, or you're going to turn those people who are underneath your ministry to be disobedient. Right. Order in the church. So, real quick, there are 4 orders of people in the church. There's the laity called the saints. Who is that? Everybody, right? We're all part of it. You're a royal, you're a holy people, holy chosen people, a royal priesthood, a people belonging to God. That's what Peter says, right? So that's the first part. We're saints, we're laity. The second group is the deacons, and it's actually the same word doulos which Paul used at the beginning of this book. They're ordained. Now, I realize in some churches to become a deacon, all you have to do is tithe and show up on Sunday. Okay, this is talking about an ordained role into the diaconate. It's an ordained to serve the church, and they must have high qualifications, and they're talked about in 1 Timothy. But there's the role of the saints, the laity, the deacon, and then the presbyters, which is the priests. Their ministry was to teach true doctrine to the local congregation. Do you know the most important calling on any priest is, and by teaching it doesn't necessarily mean in a large group. It could be one-on-one too. But to teach and equip people for the ministry. And too often, churches allow their priests to be so caught up doing other things that are important, but they're secondary. And so the role of the priest is to teach and equip. That's the first role. And then finally, after that, so there's the laity, the deacon, the priest, and then the bishop, who's the overseer of the congregation. What a bishop is like ours, they're overseeing the area of Florida, Lower Georgia, and Lower Alabama. And all the churches. We're one of the biggest dioceses in the country. And they're overseeing all the churches in those areas. So like the new bishop, Alex, he's already talked to me about grabbing lunch with me. He wants to hear about the ministry here. He wants to get to know the priests better so that he can talk with us and he can be the best pastor to the pastors. Does that make sense? All right. But that's why the qualifications here for an overseer are extremely high. An overseer is entrusted with the work of God. He must be blameless. See, notice it said blameless again, right? That must be important to Paul because he keeps saying it. Not overbearing. What's overbearing look like? Pushy. Dictator. You believe what I believe or get out. Or think what I think or get out. Now, it's one thing when it's true biblical doctrine. It's another thing when a bishop has an opinion, and if you don't agree, he kicks you out, right? That's what overbearing would be. Don't be quick-tempered. That's obvious. Don't give in to drunkenness. Not violent. Not pursuing dishonest gain. Isn't it interesting? There's a book by Richard Foster called Money, Sex, and Power. And those are the 3 areas that it says that Christian leaders deal with the most. And here it is right here in Titus, dealing with these issues for us. So, rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, who's self-controlled. What does self-control look like in a Christian? What? Sober. Okay, that's a start, right? Right? Don't show up to Bible study after drinking, tons of vodka or something, right? Yeah. Discipline. Now, I like that term. What is the positive side of discipline? What's it look like? There you go. Goal setting and accomplishing it as best as one can, right? Excuse me? The ability to correct. Would you expect that a bishop is disciplined in his Bible study? Would you expect they're disciplined in prayer? Right? In church attendance? Right? I mean, all those things. I mean, these are all disciplines of the Spirit that are expected in a leader. Okay. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. So, can you see, why does Paul start with all of these rules for Titus? So he knows what a leader looks like, right? He comes across a leader and he sees these characteristics. He can say, you're one I want, right? I mean, if I found out that one of our vestry leaders was not doing any of these things, that I found out they were getting drunk, that they were extremely angry all the time, and all these other things, would it be wise for me to ask them to step down? Yes, right? Or if you found that out about me, whether you may not feel that place, you might be wise to talk to the bishop about saying Matt may need a break, right? Okay, so you can see why it's so important in what he's going through. Any comments? I'm going to take the last 2 minutes and cover the last part of this, and we're going to and then we're going to jump into. It's a firm foundation for those coming in the church, right? Let's. And let's be frank, all of us, if we've seen the news in any way over the last 5 to 7 years, we've seen a lot of corruption in a lot of different churches. And I hope you don't mind me sharing it, but Annette and I were talking about how the Baptists who used to always make fun of the Roman Catholics, now they're getting it back themselves also. Because it's all that kind of just foul stuff is being found in some of the leadership in their church too. Because there's no denomination that's beyond sin, right? And why it's so valuable to constantly be checking ourselves, but also have accountability above us, checking in with us regularly and making sure. I can't tell you how many times. How long have you been my senior warden, James? What? It's been 6 months. How many times do you think you've checked in with me to see if I'm doing all right personally? I was going to say like 20 times, 25 times, whatever. So we check in on each other, and we are accountable to each other. Now, you don't just share your junk with anybody, obviously, but you're accountable to other people, and it's how we stay strong. I'm not going to get into the next section. I don't think we can get there today. Does anybody have any last thoughts about anything we talked about today? Well, this is your guideline to know who's called to leadership in a church, right? And what you should be looking for is character. You notice, at any point, are the characteristics that they have to be wealthy? Does it say anything about a certain age? No. A lot of the things we consider, does it say anything about their place in the community, meaning whether they're a wealthy entrepreneur or anything like that? Isn't it fascinating? All the things that the world would say are the most important things in a leader, the Bible talks about the inner character of the person being the most key thing to developing leaders within the church. So, any last thoughts on this evening's? I don't think we know, to be honest. He may have finished his whole ministry there, as far as we know. This is the last we hear about Titus, because the only history we have is in Acts, really. And so in Acts, it ends with Paul and him being on Crete, and we know from this letter he sent Titus back to Crete, but we don't have any other information. Now, I could check. Let me do a little research on that, because it's possible the fathers, the early church may have more testimony about that I'm not familiar with. But biblically speaking, we have no other information to have any idea whether he was well received or not at the time. So. And that might point out something there too. Yeah, that's a good point. So, all right, so this week was mostly about leadership. Next week, we're going to jump a few verses, and then we're going to jump right into about older men and older women, how they should act. So, decades from now, when you ladies get a little older, you're going to have a preview of how to act, all right? All right.